Hello and welcome to the Symposium Frontiers of Reproducibility. My name is Alan Love. I'm director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And we are hosting this event as part of the project that you can see above me, the Many Faces of Reproducibility, a 3-year initiative here at the University of Minnesota to study different aspects of scientific reproducibility with the aim of improving our scientific process and better understanding the reliability of the results that derive from it. The symposium that we are holding tonight is the result of more than a year of planning. However, at the outset of that planning, it was not under the COVID situation that we're currently in. However, we are responding to that and continuing to press ahead with this event in the new format online that this situation prompts. I wanted to make sure that you were familiar with all three of our guests for tonight. We have Allison Ledgerwood, who is from the Department of Psychology at UC Davis. We have Wendy Wood, who is from the Department of Psychology at the University of Southern California. And we have James Evans, who is from the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. And I'll say a little bit more about each of them when I introduce their individual presentations, but I wanted to highlight that some of you may have noticed that Kathleen Voss, who was originally listed to be on the program, is not present with us. She had a death in the family and was unable to join us. And so I wanted to just flag that in advance in case someone had a question about why she was not with us tonight as a part of this event. Now, the structure for what we're doing is as follows. Each of our presenters will have approximately 20 minutes to give us an overview of their ideas about the frontiers of reproducibility. I will follow that with a few questions of clarification, giving each of them an opportunity to say a little bit more. And along the way, it also gives you the opportunity to ask questions and to suggest those, which you can do with the link that's provided in the chat box. We will monitor those questions and use them in the general discussion at the end. Additionally, we have 2.5 hours, which is a good chunk of time, and we recognize that not everyone will be able to stay with us the entire time, but if you do need to take a break, those moments in between the presentations might be the best time to do so. So with that structure in mind and a sense of what's coming, let me introduce our first speaker, Allison Ledgerwood, who is a professor of psychology and a Chancellor's Fellow at UC Davis. Her work is in a number of areas of psychology, but what drew our attention to her in the present context is that she has been very visible in advocating for improving scientific methods, publishing on ways in which psychology as a science can do a better job of improving reproducibility. And it's those sorts of things that we are excited to hear her speak to tonight as she talks about replicability and beyond, reimagining science as truly open. With that, I turn the floor over to you, Allison.
Comes to analyze and report. Many researchers are now pre-registering analysis plans to allow readers to better calibrate their confidence in a given set of results and conclusions. Now, this push for replicability and open science is by no means the first reform movement that science has seen. In fact, scientists have been pushing for change in academia for some time, along what are often considered distinct avenues, like confronting systemic gender inequity and the underrepresentation of women in STEM, and confronting racial inequities and increasing racial diversity. But scientists pushing for change along each of these individual avenues would be the first to tell you that progress has been slow and usually very difficult. And we argue that progress is slow and maybe even doomed to fail because these aren't actually independent avenues. They're more like interlocking puzzle pieces. Now, to understand why these puzzle pieces interlock, we have to understand our history. If we instead ignore history and just focus on what's happening right now, right in front of us at our institutions, we might try to reform science by, say, building or strengthening diversity initiatives that are designed to increase the pipeline of underrepresented group members. And that's great, but it's incomplete and it won't work on its own. And that's because when somebody does get through that pipeline, they're going to encounter a system that definitely was not designed for them. And it wasn't designed with replicability and openness in mind either. And so in this talk, I'm going to argue that any attempt to reform science, to change where we're going, has to start by examining where we've been. That is, to shape the future, we have to understand where we are now. And to understand where we are now, we have to look at the past, at how we came to be this way. So what happens when we do consider history? We see that the academy was built by and for who? For affluent white men in Western democratic societies. So for example, many universities in the US were designed to educate wealthy white men to be contributing members of society. Science, as we know it, has both formally and informally excluded anyone who was not white or male for centuries. And our modern institutions were largely created by and for white men. Perhaps not surprisingly then, these men created a culture that catered to their experiences, needs, and values. A culture that overrepresents and overvalues the experiences and perspectives and needs of white Western male people. So for example, the path to scientific discovery was and continues to be defined as a competitive individual pursuit of knowledge. If two scientists are working on the same question, it's a race to see who can get there first. In tenure letters or award decisions, you're often asked to compare one individual against other members of the cohort or the pool to say who is doing the best. The sharing of ideas and resources and data has traditionally been discouraged, lest someone else get credit for your discovery. Sharing has been devalued or not seen as an important contribution in and of itself. So in my home discipline of psychology, for example, you don't ever collect a data set and immediately share it with the world before you've published from it yourself, because you wouldn't get any credit for just sharing the data, even if that sharing enabled a flurry of scientific discoveries. And success is traditionally measured as individual output, like the number of publications that one researcher has, rather than, for example, collective output or contributions to a scientific system. But it doesn't have to be this way. There are other ways that science could be set up, right? So we could define the path to scientific discovery as collaborative, as a collective pursuit of knowledge. We could encourage and value explicitly the sharing of ideas, of data, and of resources. And we could measure success as the quality of processes or as collective output rather than individual output. So we happen to have the culture on the left here rather than something more like the right or something else. And we can see that the creation of this culture had to do with who was in the room when the institutions were being built, right? The people in the room created something that worked for them. That's in some ways a very natural thing to do. So we've created a system that values individual output and competitiveness. But meanwhile, there's a lot of other stuff that has to happen to make science function and flourish. So there's the care work of mentoring and teaching students, the service work of keeping the academy running and making it a better place, and the essential but often invisible work of addressing diversity in departments, institutions, and fields. Then there are contributions to research that make scientific research better at the collective level, but that don't necessarily translate into increased individual output. So things like creating apps, R packages, blog posts, and other open resources that help other researchers do their work more effectively and efficiently. Things like sampling harder to recruit populations to increase the generalizability of our body of scientific knowledge, and things like using methods that cost additional time and resources, but enhance replicability and transparency. So who does this kind of work? Well, obviously everybody does some, and there are individual differences in who does more, but for decades, research has also documented striking group level disparities in who takes on this work and who is expected to take it on. And it boils down to the fact that a disproportionate amount is shouldered by women, by faculty of color, and by graduate students. So the problem here is really that a culture that caters to and prioritizes the needs and values of a subset of people is also going to exclude and devalue everyone else. This exclusion contorts and diminishes all aspects of science by restricting the diversity of identities and perspectives that are held by people who enter a given scientific field, by burdening the people who do persist in the face of exclusion and rejecting systemic changes that would ease their path, by deprioritizing and delegitimizing research questions that depart from the dominant viewpoint, and for disciplines that study humans, by undervaluing all participant perspectives outside of those reflecting a narrow slice of the human population. Now, none of this should be surprising given our history, who our institutions were designed to cater to. But it is problematic, right? Because it leads to a system where we have a replicability crisis, a generalizability crisis, rampant inequity, and a generally very precarious system of doing science. So understanding this fabric of our history and our current scientific culture is crucial for moving forward because it clarifies that various systems of inclusion and exclusion in science are interlocking. You can't pull on the thread of sexism without also addressing racism. You can't make science more open without thinking about and addressing the many factors that keep it closed. We have to address the fabric, in other words, as opposed to the individual threads. So how do we do that? We think that we need to reimagine and reinvent our incentive systems. And we need to do it now. So the pandemic creates both a unique opportunity, while everything is disrupted anyway, and it creates a particular urgency, since inaction at this moment is going to greatly compound the inequities that already exist in our system. There are so many examples of this, but you can look at journal submission rates by men and women over the last few months across a range of different disciplines as just one illustration of how if we don't act now, if we don't intervene now in our incentive systems, the inequities that we have are just going to get much, much worse over the next few years. Okay, so what do? Let's start with a couple of examples of how we can intervene at the level of our departments or universities. So imagine, for one example, if instead of bean counting publications and grant dollars for hiring and promotion decisions, we started evaluating quality of process. Like if science is a building, then we evaluate the quality of the processes that are used to construct that building rather than just how tall is the building. Or as another example, instead of soliciting letters that focus on individual research output, we could solicit, and ourselves write, letters that assess inclusive excellence and contributions to science as a collective system. At the level of our journals, imagine that if instead of only publishing traditional papers, high-impact journals also published open data sets that could themselves make a substantial contribution to advancing collective and cumulative knowledge. So no paper, no result section, just a carefully collected and curated data set that enables other researchers to make discoveries, but it counts as a top-tier publication. Or imagine if instead of handling manuscripts in the order that they're received at a journal, we fast-tracked papers from junior and/or underrepresented authors, especially in disciplines where the review process can take months. And finally, at the level of our professional societies, imagine if instead of awards for individual achievements and star researchers, we gave awards for constellations and collaborations. Or that instead of relegating diversity issues to one particular committee, as if this is a specific concern that can be adequately addressed separately from everything else a society is doing, we baked these kinds of considerations into every single aspect of how our societies function. So these are just a handful of specific examples. There are more, but I actually think that just imagining is a really important part of this process. You know, just starting to notice the default assumptions that we make every day about what is valuable or the right way to do things, or that's how it's always been done, that's just the way we do things. Start to question those assumptions and start to imagine alternatives to those ways of doing things. And then if you yourself have power or can collectively mobilize with other people, you can formalize that process. You can work in your department or university or journal or society to engage in strategic planning around the goal of reimagining our incentive systems to make science more open and inclusive. So I will stop there and just thank my collaborators once again, and thank all of you for listening. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Allison. So let me just remind everyone who is listening that we have a link for you to ask questions and let us know along the way that you can submit at any time. I wanted to just follow up on Allison's presentation with a couple questions that occurred to me in thinking about this. So your title is Reimagining Science as Truly Open. But you could argue that your title was maybe also captured by saying Reimagining Science as Truly Different. That is different from the way we currently think about it. Yet at the same time, I could imagine that the structure of individual sciences are affected by some of these things in different ways. Not that they don't share some of the same patterns that you're talking about, but they don't all have identical practices that would require the same instead of imagining dynamic that you offered to us. So I'm curious if you think that the timeline for this, and I'm highlighting the timeline in part because you emphasized the pandemic as a sort of prompt for doing something. Is it the case that if we began to do this, how soon would we see results, and would we see results maybe more quickly in some areas rather than others? Would we expect there to be more of a wholesale, everybody would just switch? I'm curious just to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the question of, there's sort of two questions in one there. One is about, and what if I stop sharing so that it's just us? Ooh, I like that better. Yeah. So I think there are two kind of interlocking questions. One is about timing, and one is about can you use kind of the same blueprint across all disciplines? Mm-hmm. I don't know which one to answer first, and they're both trying to come out of my mouth at the same time, which doesn't work, it turns out. So in terms of for all disciplines, I'll start with that one. Right. I think, you know, it's really important to contextualize attempts to reform science within a particular discipline. It's not going to work to have a one-size-fits-all approach, partly because it's really important to understand not just kind of the global history of science and higher education and the academy, but also the specific history of a discipline. And then within that, the specific history of, you know, if I'm thinking about how to change my university, I want to understand, like, what's the history of my university? If I'm thinking about how to change a journal, I want to understand, like, where did this journal come from? Who started it, and how did it work, and why were these policies put into place in this way? And so I think you can do that sort of historical, I don't usually say these, like, it's only recently that I started thinking about history as so central to everything, but but I think you can do that kind of historical analysis wherever you are in whatever roles or institutions you're kind of operating within. And that's important, and that's going to inform then what you do, because it's going to be very specific to the discipline or the institutions. But I think the same kind of blueprint of consider that history, start questioning the assumptions. There are so many things where at least my gut reaction has been, but that's just the way psychology works. That's just the way that our journals work. That's just the way you do it. Of course, that's the right way to do it. That's how we do it. That's how I've always done it. And it's been really useful for me to start challenging that assumption in my own head every time I catch myself doing it, because no, this wasn't like created in some sort of like, let's look at everything and design the optimal system that would work the best for the societies and disciplines that we have today. This is a relic of our history and how it happened to be set up. And so I think we can take that sort of instead of imagine approach and apply it in very different disciplines to come up with some answers that will be similar and some that will be different. In terms of timeline, I think that my urgency, or the urgency that I tried to convey that's created by the pandemic, is about starting. And there are some things that we can start that can go into effect pretty quickly that actually don't require a lot of people. Like a journal editor can just change the policies, or a publications committee, depending on how the journal works, right? You can just change the policies. You can do it right now. And a department can, let me think of another quick example. A society can decide to add a new award. Now, a society will say we can't because our board meeting is until the summer, and also we have to go through a process to fund the award. But awards don't have to be funded, or you could split up the money from the existing awards differently, and you could have a board meeting via the internet to talk to each other right now, right? So some of these oh, it's going to take time things, I'm skeptical of, because we're just kind of slow moving by default, and we can make things happen quicker when we want to. And I think the pandemic has shown us that. There's a lot of recalibrating that we had to do right away. Other things will take a lot more time, like totally reimagining how we do promotion decisions at the level of a department or a university. That's a bigger thing. But we have to start working on it now, and we have to take into account who is able to work now and who is able to be in the room now in those discussions, because there are so many disparities that are exacerbated by the situation that we're in.
So that's helpful, and I think that it makes a lot of sense that there's a kind of recommendation to go to the relevant unit, and the relevant unit might not be a discipline like psychology. It might actually be the journal or the society, and kind of different steps would be taken in different units to make that progress. So I can imagine that many people will be on board and excited with this kind of forward thinking. But I can also envision some people might not be, and might be quite resistant to some of the imaginings that you offered us. And they would be resistant to it in the following way. They would say, look, the system that we have set up, or the practice at a particular journal, however you want to carve it up, it is there and has produced good work in the past. So in a sense, it would be a way of saying, yes, we recognize that there are problems with reproducibility, but maybe there are not problems universally, and we don't want to give up the good. We don't want to give up what we were able to do and the practices we had in place to do that. And let me just give one example that I think maybe brings this out, and that's peer review. Because in the context of peer review, many people have highlighted that there's some real advantages to bringing that out into the open, making it sort of more transparent than it has been in the past. And yet, there's also a little bit of a trade-off there, because when peer review is fully open, you can have situations where people might feel uncomfortable expressing critical opinions and especially if there are power asymmetries that exist within areas, you might imagine that that could look good in the long run, but might be a lot harder to do in the short run, and might then constitute an argument on the part of some people who want to resist these maneuvers. So how do you respond to those kinds of reactions to this kind of recommendation policy that you're advancing?
Yeah, I think it's really important to ask that question. So thank you. And I think it's important not to conflate worrying about like, well, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's actually like a terrible saying. Okay, sorry. But like, worried about throwing out the good with the bad, and worrying about just sort of adopting a new system without thinking through the possible pitfalls. I think there are real concerns to be aired and addressed there, and I think sometimes those get brought up and they're sort of mushed together and conflated with a general resistance to change, and then they get seen as just resistance to change, and then you get like two camps: one that's like throw it all away, and one that says keep it all the same, and that's not very productive, right? And I think most people fall somewhere in between. So it's not very productive also because most people would like to do something in the middle of those two things. I think that, you know, I think about, you know, that concept of like local maxima and global maxima from like in statistics or in evolution. Like the idea is that you can have a system that if you start it at a certain point and it gets a little bit better and a little bit better, then it can get to a local maximum that's actually not as good as it could get, but to get to the best possible, the global maximum, you'd have to go down first to get back up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think about that a lot. Like I think these concerns about like, oh, but what about the things we'll lose are kind of concerns about starting to go down that slope, but aren't yet envisioning where we could be. And so for me, this process of questioning assumptions is how you kind of get like just get out of that system for a moment. Don't assume that the way we are doing things is the best way to do things. If we were starting totally from scratch, what are the things that are important to us? Okay, one thing that's important to us is taking concerns about status and reputation out of our evaluation of of other people's research. So how would we build a system where that was in place? And maybe it would look something like our current review system, in that you would have anonymous reviews, or maybe you would sign reviews some of the time, or maybe there would be a process for reviews being published but not necessarily attached to a name, or maybe, right? Like, so you can start thinking about creative solutions that address both the concern about kind of a closed backdoor review process where there's all this work going on hidden from the public, and people can keep some research out of from being disseminated ever just because they don't like somebody or they don't like the conclusion. That's not good. But neither is it good for me to be worried about saying that a paper has some really problematic analyses in it because the person who wrote the paper has power over me in some way, right? So how do we design a system that addresses both of those things? We can do it. We just have to sit down and think it through.
So I'm going to plant this as a seed for our conversation later. Because you brought up the metaphor of the local versus global optima. And I think maybe one thing that would be interesting to get everybody's perspective on and think about a little bit more is there a single global optimum that we should be working towards or not? And I think that's a hard question. So thank you for getting us started. Very stimulating. I'm sure people are going to have a lot of questions. Let's now transition to our next speaker, Wendy Wood, who is coming to us from the University of Southern California, where she is the Provost Professor of Psychology and Business in the Department of Psychology and the Marshall School of Business. She has published a variety of different work in psychology, but one of the things that put her on my radar was her participation in a committee of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that was specifically looking at reproducibility and replicability in science, that met and actually produced a report, which is available online for those who are interested, from the National Academies. So Wendy has been thinking about these issues quite intensely and in a way that is directly for not just psychology, but also across the sciences. So we're looking forward to her sharing with us today something that might sound counterintuitive. Should science be 100% replicable? Wendy.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you everyone in the audience for being here. I will share my screen with you. There we go. Okay. And so let me start off by asking you to think of your answer to the question that is the title of my talk: should science be 100% replicable? Now, you might have a sort of a gut level reaction to that, and many of us did who were on the committee that Alan mentioned, Reproducibility and Replicability in Science, which was a 1.5 year long meeting of scientists from all different disciplines. We sat around a large table and discussed how these issues played out in our discipline in science. And there were a number of different perspectives on this, and I'm not sure why I can't. Number of different perspectives on this. Some arguing sort of what you might think is the obvious answer, which is 100%. If we had control over science, obviously we'd want 100% replicability. Others were less certain. And I'm going to argue that the diversity of answers on our committee, and maybe among the audience, although I can't see you, so I don't know, but I'm guessing, reflects the different ways we're thinking about reproducibility and replicability. So reproducibility, as we defined it in the report, is when you get the same results analyzing a data set that is already being analyzed. So you're using the same computational steps, the same methods, same code, same conditions of analysis, and you're getting the same results as other people have obtained. That would be reproducibility. Same data set. That's how you define reproducibility. And it might seem like sort of, this is a low bar for science, right? Just being able to reproduce what we've done. But we're not even meeting that right now. Let me give you an example from a review that was published of 307 articles in the Journal of Computational Physics. Only 51% of the data reported in those articles was actually reproducible. So we're not quite meeting this goal yet. And how we would do this is through transparency. We would be making our data and the code that we're using to analyze it available to everyone, either by extension or intention, providing algorithms or structures to recreate the data. And then we'd be all relying on archives that are curating, storing, and making available digital artifacts so that we could reproduce existing sets, findings from existing sets of data. Now, many journals currently have this as set policy. However, there's currently quite a gap between that policy and actual practice. But let me say too, that just because we can reproduce a finding doesn't mean it's correct, right? Errors can be reproduced, just like accurate data. But by being able to reproduce findings, we can then objectively, we can actually share the data on which we are basing scientific conclusions. And I would argue that a failure to reproduce is actually a failure in science, because healthy science requires 100% reproducibility. So if you answered yes to that initial question, you may have been thinking about reproducibility. But there's another sense in which we use the term replicability, and that is finding consistent results across studies that address the same question, but in this case, each study has its own data. And there have been a number of very high-profile attempts to calculate the amount of reproducibility in various areas of science. And here I have just sort of, this is truly not a systematic representation of the reproducibility data that we have out there. But you can see that in genetics and preclinical studies in biomedicine, we get anywhere from 11% of results can be replicated to 33%. And that ranges all the way through psychology, chemistry, to engineering. The field of computational fluid dynamics has also calculated reproducibility of findings, and about 75% have replicated the main result in those, in that particular area of science. So these failures to replicate, I'm going to argue, and this may strike some people as more controversial, has both unhelpful sources and helpful sources. Unhelpful in the sense that it gets in the way of us understanding the phenomena that we're trying to understand as scientists. And helpful sources meaning it actually improves the progress of science. It contributes to the progress of science. If you pay attention to the popular literature in this area, you hear most about unhelpful sources. You hear very little about how failures to replicate can be helpful. And this is a list of the unhelpful sources that we considered in the report. And you've probably seen these before: publication bias, misaligned incentives, poor statistical inference. For those people who don't follow this closely, p-hacking is constructing your statistical tests to maximize the likelihood that you will actually achieve statistical significance. Cherry picking is selectively reporting findings, and harking is hypothesizing after the results are known. Poor study design, errors, and then incomplete reporting. All of these are very serious when they occur, but we have ways of resolving them. So for example, misaligned incentives, which Allison was focused on in the prior talk, instead of valuing productivity, you could value replicable contributions. To what extent are people creating knowledge that is replicable by others? Each of these has a solution, variety of solutions, that science is in the process, I believe, of implementing to try to address some of these challenges, these unhelpful sources. But perhaps the most unhelpful source is actually misconduct or fraud. Fabrication of data, falsification, plagiarism. We don't have much of a way of figuring out how much of a problem this is right now. But we can track it indirectly through retraction rates. And right now, retraction rates are reasonably low. They're about 4 in every 10,000 papers. We also know that misconduct is a source of about 40% of article retractions. But much of this is really concentrated because 2% of authors accounted for more than 25% of the retractions. In the analysis of retractions, there were a few differences across the fields of science, but we did see changes over time so that the number of retractions increased since the 1970s and more recently have leveled off. But like all of these kinds of data, it's hard to know how to interpret them. Is this because we're more sensitive to issues that would cause retraction? So is it a change in detection rates, or is it an actual change in incidence? Now, again, this is serious if it ever happens, but from what we could tell from this indirect data, the overall rate of misconduct is relatively low. Okay, let me go on to what I think is the more interesting point here, which is that there are actually helpful sources of failures to replicate. And I would argue that they're helpful when they signify one of two things. First, helpful sources can tell us something about the inherent complexity or the variability of the phenomenon that we're studying, because we know that nature does have a random component to it. And we can resolve this once we realize that this is occurring. We can resolve it through better estimation, better measurement tools, analysis, better control of the variables that are creating this randomness in our data. But there's another way that failures to replicate can be helpful, and that is by pointing out when scientists are overgeneralizing. And this is actually Alan's term from some of the work he has written on. Scientists overgeneralize when they fail to recognize the specific factors in a study that might influence an effect. So scientists, there have been some famous examples of this, scientists worrying about how test tubes are cleaned, whether they're shaken or stirred. All of these things can actually influence the results in ways that the scientists initially didn't recognize. But when people take these failures seriously, then they can be resolved through tests to identify what is the source of these conflicting results. And they can yield better understanding of the phenomenon that's under investigation. So I think at a very broad level, these helpful sources of failures to replicate reflect the tension between replicability and novelty and discovery. So to illustrate this, imagine that you're a psychologist and you find a whole new group of people that have never been studied before. Now, you could start off with hypotheses like, these new people are going to be hungry after missing a meal. They're going to be sleepy after staying up all night. And your answers to those kinds of questions are likely to be highly replicable because you're building closely on prior observations about what people are like, what their experiences are. But if you start off with hypotheses like this new group of people is likely to have ESP, if you found support for that hypothesis, it would be very surprising. It would really advance our knowledge if it were true. My guess, though, is it would have less opportunity to be replicable, to replicate in the future. So this is a balance that many of us as scientists are intuitively striking in our own work. How closely do we build on prior observations? How much do we seek surprising knowledge that advances science? And different fields have different norms for how they see the balance between these two forces. And some of the differences in replication across scientific disciplines is likely due to these different norms about whether a field builds closely or whether it strikes high. Strategies to reconcile in this kind of non-replication can be found in an already established approach that's present, that is used broadly across all of science. All of science has techniques for research synthesis and meta-analysis. And we know meta-analysis is pretty well understood that meta-analysis can do two things. It can estimate the amount of variability in a particular literature, sampling error. It can also give us a summary value of the size of an effect in a particular literature. But what's not often recognized is that meta-analysis also allows us to test sources of non-replicability that were not recognized in the original studies. So let me give you an example, again from psychology, that social psychologists have for a long time thought that there's a real difference between the kinds of explanations I, as an actor, offer for my own behavior and the explanations that I offer when I am an observer of your behavior. A meta-analysis that was done in the mid-aughts, however, found no systematic differences between actors and observers. And this was really surprising because this is part of the lore in our field. But instead, what he found was that there are very consistent effects for studies that used positive behaviors. And for those, actors are very much more likely to take responsibility when they engaged in the behavior than when they're observing somebody else who did. For negative behaviors, though, for studies that happen to look at negative examples of behavior, actors are less likely to take responsibility, but I'm more likely to give responsibility to you for your negative behavior when I'm an observer. So the valence of the incident turned out to be a big predictor in this meta-analysis of what kinds of explanations actors and observers offered. And the original researchers did not recognize this effect. It had to emerge through a meta-analysis that looked to reconcile differences across a whole literature. So, in summary, I think it's pretty non-controversial that we should all be looking for 100% reproducibility, because successful science depends on this, and that's ensured through transparency. But how much replicability we want, we couldn't decide on the committee. And so if you came up with different numbers than 100% in your answer to this question, you may have been thinking about the more complex concern that failures can be created by unhelpful sources, either unintentionally or even fraudulently. But failures to replicate can also be helpful because they can help spur scientific discovery. They can help us understand complexity, the natural complexity in the phenomena we're studying, as well as try to understand what we're generalizing across, that we should actually be differentiating. We should actually be studying systematically. So in conclusion, I think it's easy to misunderstand the role of replication in science. I think people, particularly the public, wants a clear answer. Science, of course, should be 100% replicable. But you even see this answer in education policy and teaching of science. And I think this is actually misaligned with the reality of what happens when we practice science. That there is a necessary role of failures to replicate. And I've seen in my own lab that when young scientists don't expect these, that they can be discouraged unnecessarily. Instead of seeing these as an opportunity to spur further investigation and understanding of a phenomenon, they sometimes stop and are discouraged by the failure. And I hope that as we gain a more sophisticated knowledge of the role of replication failures in science, that we're going to start to understand this and perhaps train people so that they learn to take advantage of this when it occurs. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I really like that final note where you're highlighting a realistic image of the sciences that would then be conveyed not only to the next generation of scientists as they are developing, but also to the wider public so they understand it. I want to sort of ask maybe a devil's advocate question about the non-replicability, because it certainly seems like you've made a strong case that we can learn from these situations where we encounter non-replicability, especially the helpful situations that you highlighted. But I can envision especially those who are funding science and providing the finances to make it happen, that there might be concern that if you don't sort of get replicability, somehow you might be wasting resources in the process of inquiry. And so I'm curious about how you would respond to somebody who raised that type of concern about the potential advantages of non-replicability. Is that just maybe a trade-off? We have to break eggs to make the omelet?
That is, I think, a very common concern with this way of thinking about replicability, almost as if it's an apologist perspective for scientific failures. But I view it instead, and I think it will come to be viewed instead as an additional reason to control all of the unhelpful sources of replicability. Because once we do that, we're going to understand much better what are the helpful sources and when they occur. We're going to be able to identify them much more clearly. So sort of cleaning the decks of all of these other things that can drive failures to replicate will allow us to see these helpful sources more clearly. And so allow us to use them in the way that science is fashioned already to do so. But we don't always know whether the failures to replicate at this point are due to some of the more negative factors. And so that's holding us back, I think. So really, I think this is an argument for fixing the issues, the challenges that are unhelpful, and then moving on, we'll be able to handle the more successful ones, the helpful ones better.
That makes sense. So there's another thought that occurred to me, especially right towards the end, that one of the things that is a part of that image of science that not just the wider public, but as you indicated, those who are starting out in the sciences sometimes harbor. And that one of the features that seems like is built into that picture is that we already know what is out there. Now we're just trying to explain it, or trying to give an account of it, or something along those lines. And yet many of the things that you have described with respect to non-replicability in helpful conditions, such as overgeneralization or complexity and variability, they're sort of about us learning what's out there in the first place. That it's things we weren't aware of at the beginning. And part of the surprise, as you highlight, the novelty, is the recognition that we didn't know to ask that question at the start because we stumbled into it as part of the process. So I wonder if you think that that might be a helpful framing for communicating the significance of non-replicability to help people sort of recognize that the sciences are still discovering new things, and to discover new things is to discover things you didn't know were there and you don't know exactly how to measure them properly and all of the kind of associated difficulties.
Yes, that's certainly true with science, science, areas of science, and with that focus on novelty and discovery, and individual researchers who ask questions in that format. But there are also other sciences that tend to focus a bit more, as you were saying, on building cumulatively and sticking very close to what we know. So I actually think there's a lot of diversity across fields in how they approach that particular tension that I described. And you're right, science has done a better job of explaining one of those approaches than the other. And so maybe in understanding how much we don't know and how much we're learning, sometimes by happenstance, sometimes by systematic analysis and review, maybe that would make all of this make more sense to the public. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think I'm going to sort of put the same pin in your conversation that I did at the end of Allison's, because I really want to come back to this in our general discussion together. But it seems like you also maybe just gave us a partial answer to this question about whether we would expect a global optimum for how scientific research should be organized, because it may be that if there is this diversity in the landscape, we should be looking for the relevant optima for those different tasks. And that part of the problem would be having the expectation that everybody should be doing the same thing.
Yes, that was one of the amazing things sitting on this panel. We met for a year and a half, and understanding how different sciences actually proceed was fascinating. Some sciences, like earthquakes, seismology, they're studying events that can't be replicated. So the whole question about replicability was foreign to some of those folks. It's very interesting, the diversity in what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got more to talk about for sure. Thank you, Wendy, very much. Great presentation. Let's now transition to our last speaker, James Evans, who is coming to us from the University of Chicago, where he's in the Department of Sociology. He's a professor there and also the director of the Knowledge Lab and a computational social science master's program, as well as being an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. His research has focused on the social organization of the sciences, and he has given us some interesting and penetrating analyses of what that landscape looks like. And today he's going to share with us the social limits of knowledge. So James, I've turned things over to you.
Okay, great. Alan, thanks so much. And thanks to our prior speakers. This has been really illuminating. I'm just setting a soft and gentle chime to remind me of the time I'm supposed to be up here. So I'm really going to talk about the social limits of knowledge and how to think about the possibility of pushing beyond them in a number of ways. So as Alan mentioned, I'm at the University of Chicago, and I run a little center at Chicago and Santa Fe called Knowledge Lab, which really tries to take large-scale data, machine learning, and kind of intelligent or interactive crowdsourcing with the scientific community to represent knowledge, to understand it, which is to do kind of a big data science studies, and then to use it to form statistical instruments that we can use to change that process, to update institutions. And so we've been part of a series of discussions to attempt to kind of, to basically apply the full imaginary of science to the scientific process itself, and to really build out the diversity of perspectives. So this investigation or interest in reproducibility came out of a broader question that I had on how does science as a system think? And I'm viewing science as a complex system. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on the existence of bubbles in science, which create the illusory appearance or perception of reproducibility, but that they actually limit the broader opportunities for reproducibility beyond those bubbles. So I'm going to talk about how dense social and epistemological and methodological connections can distort collective certainty. And this really kind of kicked off for me in a little study that we did of reviewers, and we found in a journal called PLOS ONE, in which the only ostensible criteria for being published is not the significance of the findings or other quote unquote subjective criteria, but whether or not the findings are perceived as accurate. And we found in that environment that inter-rater reliability, so inter-reviewer reliability by review round, was basically essentially random, like a Rorschach test in the first round. And it basically scaled super linearly with distance from the author in kind of the co-authorship networks, which is to say that people who were really close in the space really believed that the work that they were reviewing was legitimate work, not just good work, exciting work, but also just accurate work, which suggests that we have clustered epistemologies across this space. And so I'm going to talk about this in the context of replication, how centralized communities end up generating less replicable results. And this comes in the context of this kind of broader perception of a replication crisis. I think it's a perception because it's likely it may or may not be more or less relative to the past. And our approach methodologically to get at this will be high throughput strategies for conceptual replication and reproducibility. And so we've got a number of studies here. I'll discuss one in some detail just to give you the sense, and then I'll kind of point to some of the others and some of their implications for how we might think about replication. So one study that we did was we looked at drug-gene interactions. So this is how drugs relate and interact with disease-relevant genes. And we kind of asked the question, well, what's the collaboration structure that would bolster results, robustness, and replicability across labs? Is it a sparse structure where people are completely disconnected using different methods, different prior knowledge that they're drawing upon, they're not communicating with one another? Or would it be a situation in which they're completely connected, or would it be somewhere in the middle? And so for this study, we just took about 80,000 claims in the drug-gene interaction literature, and then we lined them up with a massive replicated high-throughput experiment, right? So in that experiment, each one of these claims was reproduced about 200 times in accounting for varying time that you would let the tissue sample kind of soak in the drug of choice, the amount of the drug, the different cell lines that these were exposed to, et cetera. And then initially we just wanted to see, okay, well, if we just take the probability of support in the literature, which we'll take as the support or replication by the independents in the literature, we'll line it up with these high throughput experimental results. Not that those high throughput experimental results should necessarily be seen as like the ground truth, but that they should be uncorrelated with the kinds of influence dynamics that we might see in a scientific community. And when we do this, we find that the science is not totally broken, that there is collective correction in science, that where there's a lot of independent support for something, this lines up with high likelihood of replication in these high throughput studies. When there's really contentious support for something, then it ends up aligning with contradictory results across cell lines, for example, in these studies. So it's unsurprising that people who are studying the phenomena with different cell lines or in different amounts discover different things, because when you do this massive replicated study, then you find the same result. But when we look at the centralization of those scientific communities, right? So to what degree are a few social actors spreading their influence widely across these spaces? And we look at the overlap or independence of the persons who are studying these things, the methods that are being studied, and the prior knowledge that's being drawn upon in the context of citations, we see something very different. In fact, we see the opposite pattern. And this is a concern because we find this kind of paradoxical phenomena in the success of fields. So whenever fields grow, their growth is associated with an exponential decrease in the likelihood that a new finding can enter the canon of those fields. So fields, as they grow, they essentially crystallize in terms of the core findings that become assumptions or axioms in their research to follow. So if we measure the field from this perspective, in terms of the degree of author methodological and kind of prior knowledge insight, then we actually find, I'm just kind of jump to the end of this. We find bubbles, that social dependencies are correlated with limited methodological variation. And we find that findings from centralized communities are decentralized communities are much more likely to replicate. Which is to say, those that really are constituted by disconnected social researchers who are not engaged in continuous communication. They're not using the same methods. Really, they're not essentially from the same fields. End up being much more likely to replicate. And one of the reasons is because if you're performing the experiment many different times, but you're engaged in intensive collaboration and communication, you're sharing, for example, the postdoc or the student who's actually doing the analysis of the research, you're not performing an experiment many different times. You're performing the same essential experiment over and over again, which could lead to a reproducible but fragile phenomenon, which is to say, if it's perturbed in any way, if you try to take that into the clinic in the context of drug-gene interactions, it's very unlikely to replicate. versus experimental conditions that end up varying, which identify robust conditions. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but for the purpose of disseminating knowledge, for the purpose of broad scale knowledge that can be transposed across fields, then the diversity in the inquiry ends up shaping the robustness of those findings for conceptual replication across fields. And so we find, again, this probability of centralization and social independence are inversely related to this probability that the claims become replicated. So connected communities end up yielding these kinds of weakened results. Independent, decentralized research communities end up promoting robust findings, but they face coordination problems, and they also face necessarily increased failure rates, right? So if everybody is trying to succeed, then they are, if they're Bayesian reasoners, they're going to kind of jump on the bandwagon. If everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, they're more likely as individuals succeed, but the entire field is much less likely to cover the space of possible findings. And so the end results globally are less robust. So you have this disconnect between individual incentives and field level incentives, which I think is deeply problematic and was raised by our first speaker today. Now, we've looked at this in other contexts to try to figure out, well, can we take this and use it to improve our understanding of science as a whole? So for example, if we look at gene-gene interactions with a different data set, can we take these biases? Here you can see the relationship between average published claims and experimental interactions, and the distributions are vastly different because people publish really strong positive effects, and experimental interactions calculate the full range of effects, and the interaction between those reveals the way in which a search for priority and really kind of individual acclaim ends up casting a very different light on the space of scientific possibilities than a much broader search. Well, it turns out that if you apply a relatively simple Bayesian calculus to this, which is you identify factors related to the way in which science searches, and you take them into account, you can do much better at predicting the likelihood that a particular finding will actually replicate in the future. And so we were able to predict, just as a function of taking into account the fact that research communities, for example, are highly coalescent in some places and distributed in others, we were able to dramatically improve the likelihood that we could predict which findings really are uncertain and which one are more certain if we attempted to engage in replication. We looked at this across a wide range of features, and really we found that the absolute size of the broader investigative community facilitates triangulation and a kind of scientific surveillance that increases the likelihood of replicability. And the relative size of the focused investigative community, which is to say the degree to which the community that's studying a particular effect is really in a singular community, sharing authors, sharing methods, et cetera, decreases the likelihood of that replication pretty dramatically, which suggests a kind of an echo chamber phenomena or a kind of an ideological bubble in the context of scientific findings. What do we do as policies? Well, we can actually look at what's happened in the data and discover things that work, and they point to an essential trade-off. So on the one hand, if you just increase the number of claim communities, so as a funder, if you increase funding for different groups in different places in the scientific space, you can dramatically increase the likelihood that you can replicate future work as a result of that work. So that's one approach, but that requires additional resources and not the smaller marginal investment that it takes to fund a little bit more in a big research center. Alternatively, if you want to increase your total prediction and replication over the full space of claims, you would actually push investigation away from those things around which people are highly clustered. So in some sense, there's this kind of essential trade-off. If you want to identify really robust individual facts, then you invest in diversity, but diversity is expensive. If you want to understand the entire space of facts, then you spread people topically diversely over that space. And so thinking about those trade-offs, I think, could help us think about how we might want to invest in science to produce the kinds of findings and the kinds of science that will yield answers and robustness in places that we care about. We also looked at this in the context of clinical trials and other areas in medicine and elsewhere. And we find that in the past, efforts to engage in meta-analysis have focused on the over-dispersion associated with different kinds of studies, small studies, for example, finding effects which are very large findings, under finding that, and then estimating across those, grappling with this problem of over-dispersion as driving bad estimates. We find exactly the opposite finding. So we find that because of the social connection, the individual, the authorial connection between different studies in particular areas, there's actually a much larger underdispersion than one would expect a chance. And so one would expect that you would have more just random dispersion, even if the findings were as described, than you actually find, which raises concerns and has led us to work on developing metrics that kind of capture warning signs. So this is the relationship between the kind of the Gini coefficient of the authorship network, so the degree to which a few people are publishing all the papers surrounding a particular phenomena, in this case, the use of stem cells in heart regeneration, and the rate of retraction in those spaces. So we find with some systematic pattern that where you have a big bubble of individuals who are really kind of, that their ideas are not disseminating the scientific space, they are exclusively hoarding those ideas. It's very difficult for those ideas to diffuse, that often, but not always, leads to cases of retraction, where essentially they've created a bubble that is very difficult for them themselves to burst. So what does this suggest for the scientific community as a whole? Well, I think it pushes us towards thinking, hopefully, about a new form of education that can actually push us to do things that generate the kind of diversity that would allow us to not only replicate our findings, but to discover new things. So it turns out that we find that there's not always an essential trade-off between new discovery and replication, in the sense that diversity underlies the robustness of findings as they spread beyond a certain lab, as well as the likelihood of new discovery. So in another study, we looked at how science as a collective thinks, and we tried to get at, you know, to what degree is it deductively building from prior knowledge? To what degree is it basically imaginatively generalizing from observations or findings? And to what degree is it driven by abduction or surprise? Where you have this collision of expectation and deduction and findings which really violate those expectations. And where do they come from? So we looked at this in a bunch of sciences, in the physical sciences and the biological sciences and patents and inventions. We built a really intense manifold model that kind of basically predicted all of next year's papers. Again, this is a totally impoverished representation of next year's papers, just as sets of keywords, but we can predict almost all of them, like 98% of next year's sets of papers. And we can also identify those papers that are really surprising, so that basically pull together things in that manifold that are really unusual. And when we look at the surprise, basically, the surprisingness, or the improbability under this most probable model itself predicts like 60+ percent, 60 to 70% of the likelihood of being in the top 10% of citations. And it powerfully predicts large-scale awards in biology, chemistry, medicine, and physics. Where do these come from? Do they come from unusual people? Not really. Do they come from unusual teams? Actually, not really. They come systematically in both the physical and the biological sciences from expeditions of people with a certain set of expertise who travel across the scientific space and address a problem, for example, to an audience, to a journal audience that has never seen people like them before, and no one from their field has ever come in contact with a journal like this before. So these discoveries occur in conversation with aliens, between insiders and outsiders, suggesting the importance of building, if we wanted to build education for discovery, we build an education that actually sends people to different epistemic areas in the scientific space, both for replication and for discovery. A final point I'd like to raise is the question of, can we design diversity to increase collective imagination and the robustness of findings? There was a paper that came out in Nature last summer, which basically used an unsupervised AI approach to identify the likelihood that certain kinds of chemicals and materials have certain properties. And they were able to successfully predict a kind of a 40% precision or hit rate against those AI predictions. And we were curious, well, if you took into account the diversity of persons in that system, and in particular the boundaries that separated different areas of the scientific space, could you do better? And this is very recent, as yet unpublished work. So we basically built random walks that walk through that scientific space, that jump from a material property to a paper with it, to a material or an author, to another paper with them or it. And then we built, millions of these random walks, and we embedded them with the same kinds of methods that were used in the initial study. And we had, like about 125% increase in the predictability of these systems, which is to say, just by taking into account the boundaries between these knowledge areas, you can predict the likelihood that there will literally be people in those positions between fields to make inferences. And if those people are not there, it's not that the discovery is not valid or viable, it's just that there's no one to make it. And we can find this across every property that was discovered in that context. Moreover, it suggests that you can predict expected discoveries this way, but also unexpected developments, which is to say, developments which would not be made unless you made an intervention by pulling people into unusual places that education does not pull them into. And we find that we can predict effectively the discovering teams. And if we invested in different kinds of teams in different kinds of spaces, some experiments that we're working on trying to undertake, then one might be able to do much better. All this is to suggest that for AI, people talk about these artificial intelligences, for it to make a difference in science and scientific replication, we need one not that replicates or imitates human capability, but one that augments or radically augments human intelligence by understanding and programming past limits of human reason and education to train diverse ensembles of human and machine intelligences. All this to say, if we want to design diversity, the importance of designing diversity to catalyze both robustness in science and the potential for replication and generalizable extension, but also to catalyze advance, that there's similar principles that underlie both of these. And the potential that we can kind of design better diversity to facilitate both robustness and advance. A final thought is that for the evolution of sustainable advance, it suggests in the past people have really focused on promoting bridging, but I think this also suggests the importance of protecting independence. So one can see actually in the history of science that sometimes too much openness can be problematic. Not too much openness in sharing, but if everybody's focused on the same set of findings, if everyone's focused on the same core data sets, then it can basically reduce the space of conversations, that everybody collapses into the same conversation. And because people flock to identify advances which are the most useful to them as individuals, this drives this wedge between individual attainment and global robust advance. So with this, I'll close and just acknowledge my amazing collaborators.
Okay, thank you, James. Very stimulating, and certainly lots of things that come to mind. Before I ask you a couple of follow-up questions, I wanted to remind those in the audience that we are getting close to our question time. So if you do have questions, please submit them via the link that's there in the chat box. And we will be able to take those in when we bring everyone back for our general discussion. So I think my first question that I want you to say something about has to do with the way in which the very communities you're talking about as being more centralized are more centralized as a consequence of what many people have argued are greater efficiencies in doing scientific work. So let's take model organism communities that have grown up over the past few decades, where you have an incredible concentration of resources, say devoted to Drosophila or to C. elegans, and the communities are highly structured. They have stock centers that supply strains to researchers all over the world. They have newsletters where methodologies and tips for doing experiments are being shared. A lot of people would say this is a huge advance. This is an improvement. The community has benefited tremendously from this centralization. Is your thesis sort of compatible with some of that being positive development?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. You don't get something for nothing, Alan. You know, like there's a cost to the kind of economies of scale that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why do we get more and more advanced? Because we know basically more and more about less and less. Right. So as we structure these parameters, we can perform more and more faster experiments. Now, to be clear, those replications are not meaningless for biotechnology, which is to say, things that are highly replicable but highly fragile, like a particular very subtle configuration that you can reproduce in silico or in some other context. So it's reproducible, but it's like a very, very specific reproduction, which I would not really call generalized science, but those can be built into technologies which are enormously powerful and useful. On the other hand, they drive us to imagine that we have generalizable findings that basically, you know, cross to other systems in the space, and they often don't. And in fact, the findings right now, we've been gathering expressions of certainty from these scientific spaces, and it turns out that the more clustered you are, it's not only that it's less likely to replicate in another context, but you're also more likely to express certainty in that context because you're surrounded by this community that's basically working on exactly the same substrate, performing highly specialized experiments. And the same day, the first of the studies that I came out and got published, there was another study that was published by Peter Sorger, who was, you know, funded like by the same DARPA consortium that I was funded on this project, that basically showed, hey, this huge links experiment that we're performing at the NIH, you know, we can massively increase the reproducibility if we force all of these labs to basically perform exactly the same experiment. We're going to share all of our materials. And it was like, oh my gosh, you know, like, because they're trying to increase reproducibility, they're totally screwing like the possibility that this can actually extend to other systems like the clinic, which is ostensibly the reason these whole large-scale experiments were designed. So I think a kind of fixation on reproducibility and isolation can create, you know, I mean, I think that's a terrible example of trying to improve reproducibility at the cost of reuse, basically.
So one more quick follow-up before we open to general discussion, and that is, okay, Allison reminded us that the pandemic is occurring, and clearly lots of rules have changed in the interim. Is it helping? Is it hurting?
So we have been looking at it, but it's, you know, it's hard to, I mean, there have been some really interesting studies, which are, I think, you know, they're early, but I would say, on the one hand, you got a little bit more distribution disconnect, but my sense is the answer is that it's largely hurting, and here's why. So we've got some new findings that show what happens in the pandemic when you're investing in relationships. And it turns out that people are much more likely to invest in their strongest ties than their weakest ties. And that co-location within universities, so we did a large-scale survey experiment. We basically randomly select people and papers. We randomly selected sites within those papers. We identified where those sites were scientifically with respect to them, and also where the authors of those prior studies were. And if they're at the same institution that you're at, then they're much more likely to influence your work. They're much more likely to be much further from your research than they would be if you discovered them otherwise. So what's happening with a distancing world is not a replacement of this research context, but a displacement of this research context. And so you're actually much less likely to get exposed in a sustainable way to the things that are the furthest from you, which are the most likely to perturb your research in productive ways, to provide you with those opportunities for abduction.
Wow, so on that pessimistic note, I think it's time for us to open up for general discussion, because we've got a lot to talk about. So let me have Allison and Wendy come back. And so just a reminder to everyone who is listening, we are taking your questions in real time here and bringing them into a conversation with all of our panelists. And so I think, Allison, there is a question here that is focused on your presentation and asks about whether or not there is a requirement for the kind of reimagining that you suggested to us, that there's wide or broad sharing of social and political values in order to bring that kind of result about. I think that I'm reading into the question a little bit here, but I think that it might be that this is motivated by thinking that the community of scientists is relatively heterogeneous in terms of those sorts of values. And so could that potentially be an issue in the kind of reimagining that you were offering us?
A great question to think about. I think, we were talking earlier about how this reimagining can be a local, homegrown sort of thing within a specific institution and discipline, and so that makes it smaller than trying to get all of science on board with what we envision science should be like. And so I think the way to start is to do some of that envisioning or imagining in those local spaces with smaller groups, and that makes it easier to come to a consensus. But I also think the values that we're talking about are about the questions of, like, what makes good science? What features do we want science to have? Most scientists are on board with science. It's a good idea for science to be reproducible. It's a good idea for our scientific findings to be generalizable, at least insofar as we're assuming that they would generalize, right? We want to calibrate our sense of their generalizability to how generalizable they are in fact. We don't want to assume that medical findings apply to everyone when they actually just apply to white men or something like this, right? And so we want to, and we probably also want to have a well-calibrated sense of the replicability of a finding. So as Wendy was discussing, we maybe don't want every single finding to be replicable in all cases, but we want to get rid of I really liked how you said that, Wendy, like we want to get rid of the unhelpful sources of replicability so we can trust and learn from the non-replication so that they're useful as opposed to just noise and confusing. And we want to have a well-calibrated sense of how likely is something to replicate. If I do this experiment again in this context that's similar to the original context, how likely is it to replicate? I don't want to be sure of that when in fact it's not going to, right? And so I think that those kinds of values are actually pretty common across scientists, and can be the basis for thinking about sort of what does good science look like. You know, if we want things to be more replicable, you can look at things in the way that James was just describing, and kind of derive ideas of how to intervene based on those kinds of considerations.
So I hear in your response to that question that in part the shared part of the values has to do with what we would want for the sciences in, say, its knowledge structure. What we would want for generalizability, we want for applicability, translation into medical contexts, or these kinds of things. So then that seems like it casts the values of diversity as means to an end. Is that the way that you think it's best cast, or is that maybe problematic in certain ways?
I mean, I think it can be both. Diversity can be an inclusion, which are separate, can be both means and ends, right? So you could decide that, or, you know, some people might think that science that is open to everyone, like anybody who wants to be a scientist could be a scientist, is not a value that they themselves agree with for their science. But if they wanted, for their discipline or their institution, but if that person wanted to have a discipline that had innovative ideas and potentially more replicable ideas, then they might want a diversity of viewpoints that would, I mean, there was just a paper, and I'm gonna forget who the authors were, but it was talking about like innovation comes from diversity, and diversity drives innovation in sciences. I think some of the things that James was just talking about, you might see occur also in more in teams that involve people who have a wider array of experiences, right, and come at research questions in a wider array of ways and ask questions in different ways and think different methods are better for approaching those research questions, and all of that comes from diversity.
Okay. So there's a question here that is directed at Wendy. This one is, it's connected to the helpful, unhelpful distinction that you made. The question is about whether or not you can so easily root out the unhelpful while leaving intact the helpful. So I guess in the metaphor of roots, it's, can you take the weeds out and leave the things behind you want to still grow? Do you see any difficulties with kind of keeping those distinct, at least as this question suggests might not always be so easy?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we're learning about how to control the unhelpful sources of failures to replicate. I mean, the whole history of scientific methodology has been one of continually understanding what the non-helpful sources are and trying to control for them. So before I got into graduate school, there was a real concern with the idea of experimenter expectancy influencing findings. And this came from Bob Rosenthal's work. And as a result, we have established this sort of best practices of double blind, right? Experimenters shouldn't know, the participants shouldn't know what condition that they're in. But that was something that could have really been problematic, but we came up with a way to mitigate it. and as part of the development of our methodology. And I think that we are continuing to improve in this way and to narrow down the unhelpful sources, because it's easier to see those. And then hopefully the helpful sources. The theory is that the helpful sources will then become clearer once we have controlled the unhelpful ones. And I see this really as a normal progression in science, which is part of the reason why I personally reject the whole replication crisis terminology. Because I think that science is a progression, and we are all trying to do our best. And when some challenge emerges, we change scientific practices. We have in the past, and I assume that we will continue in the future as part of this philosophy.
Okay. So now I've got one that is for James, and maybe this was prompted by my question about the model organisms a little bit, which is how do you think about large physics communities such at, say, CERN or the Large Hadron Collider, where you have what would seemingly look like quite centralized research communities, and yet also seem to not maybe suffer from some of the same issues that you highlighted for, say, stem cell biology or something similar. Do you have a sort of thought on that particular domain that people are asking?
I got in trouble on this a little while ago. We published a paper that we were lucky enough to, it was on the cover of Nature, small and large teams, and there was some press coverage, and there was a quote that wasn't a misquote, but it was a selective quote in which I stated that I thought the LIGO experiment that had just won the Nobel Prize could have possibly been the most conservative experiment in history. Testing a 100-year-old hypothesis where anything that was other than the theoretical expectation, the Einsteinian estimate for general relativity was assumed to be miscalibration of the instruments. It was designed such that it could not possibly, by design, generate any surprise. That's not to say that it wasn't a really important scientific advance and that it couldn't unleash all kinds of other interesting things. But I literally got a phone call 5 minutes after that got published from the General Relativity Consortia on speakerphone in Aspen. We're like, what the, trying to get funding for our next thing. I think the answer is, who knows? When we only have as a society enough money to perform one experiment, we don't have enough money to perform 2 experiments, then we perform 1 experiment. Do we know if that's going to replicate? Who knows? Like nobody knows. And there are enormous efforts to basically simulate the instrument. But I think this is, I think this is part of that trade-off. I don't believe if we just focus on replicability, that would mean we would never perform a singular experiment. If we had just enough budget to perform that 1 experiment, we'd never perform that because we couldn't even, in theory, address the question of replicability. So I don't think, do I think they suffer from the same challenge? Absolutely. I can't think of a case in which I have seen at any team size. These consortia are constantly recalibrating each other, and so by the end, even though it's a huge community, it's a single estimate, and it's a single estimate. This production of that complex organism of an experiment. But I actually think that I think we just have to if we want to dial up replicability, we're going to kill all those experiments. I don't think that we want to do that. I don't want to do that. Because I think those kinds of experiments can lead to hypotheses that could be experimented on in smaller scale ways. I think they play a role in generating questions and answers that can be used elsewhere. So, but sure, yeah, they're more fragile. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
So this question, I think, can be something that everybody weighs in on. It's not really directed at anybody, but it's about the education dimension and how we train the next generation of scientists. And in different ways, each of you did touch on that in your presentations. And I mean, the question is basically asking what kinds of things need to be different, what kinds of things need to change, and to what degree is that feasible in light of some of the barriers that might be there, whether that's what James highlighted about insiders and outsiders and difficulties of, say, disciplinary versus interdisciplinary, whether it's what Wendy highlighted with respect to the image of science that the new graduate student has in coming into the laboratory setting and what their expectations are, or even in, I think, Allison, your discussion about, you know, the arrangement of the science with respect to who's participating and what that experience would be like from a very early stage. So I will sort of open that up to all three of you to sort of questions about the development of the next generation of scientists and what the kinds of considerations that you've given us suggest for that. Don't be shy.
I'll just say, can I nominate someone else? I thought Allison's discussion of pushing for new institutions that basically drive diversity by allowing the valuation of different kinds of contributions is just totally essential. I think the fact, for example, that computational scientists for the most part have been undervalued and as a result have exited the scientific system for industry has created, you know, just huge classes of expertise that are like available and visible in various parts of society, because basically they're undervalued in the scientific capital they get, and they're undervalued in the market capital that they would get in private industry. I mean, I think this is absolutely. I think your idea, Allison, about, you know, creating different kinds of awards that break down these kind of fictions associated with singular discovery are absolutely essential if we're going to hope to retain and sustainably kind of grow the kinds of different scientific contributions which are essential to collective advance. And I think this partly answers your other question earlier, Alan, about is there a, you know, singular optimum? And I think the answer is absolutely not. At least when we looked at team size, a multi-equilibrium solution, having small kind of like crazy disruptive teams and large scale consolidating teams, a mixture of those was much more likely to generate accelerated advance than in periods where you had an overabundance of one versus the other. So anyway. Wendy,
you were going to say something?
Nope. Let's let Allison talk.
Okay, Allison, jump in then.
I think, well, I agree with James agreeing with me, but maybe more helpfully, I think, right, changing like what we're awarding, what we're explicitly valuing. I mean, we value all of the things that make science function, and then we forget to explicitly reward them or acknowledge them, right? I think we have to change that. And then we can bring that into the classroom as well. So I think it's important to pay much more careful attention, at least than I was 5 or 10 years ago, to like who we're showing our students when we talk about science and scientists, right? Like what pictures are on the screen when we're telling people who are they imagining when we talk about who has done the work of science, and can we make clear that there's probably a greater diversity of people doing science than what our students are imagining, or what maybe even we're imagining. I think we can do a better job of talking about science as a process. So touching on Wendy's point of like leading leading our students to understand how science actually works as opposed to how science is portrayed in a textbook. I remember taking an astronomy, like a college astronomy class in high school, and learning about how the universe works, and then learning a few years later that it doesn't actually work like that anymore, and thinking like, oh, they were wrong, they told me the wrong thing, but like they hadn't, the professor just hadn't told me, hadn't sort of framed the whole thing the way that science actually works in this sort of process of accumulating information, and oops, we were wrong, and now we have a better method or a better way of asking the question or new data, and so we can update our picture of the world accordingly, and that's science, right? That kind of continual updating in response to improving methods and accruing data. And so I think we can do that better in our courses as well, both for our students who go into science, so that that's how they approach it, but also for all of our students who may not go into science but are going to be using science, right? There were so many, in the US anyway, there were so many people who were confused with in the pandemic with conflicting ideas about whether to wear masks or not early on, right? Because, oh, 1 minute the science says don't wear them, and then the next minute it says do, and 1 minute it's droplet based, and 1 minute it's airborne. But like, if I think if like I take some responsibility for that, if I were doing a better job of teaching my students research methods and how science works, then they would be expecting ahead of time that science changes and adapts.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that's said. To focus more on how people deal with failure. I mean, we do school our graduate students right now to understand that they're not going to always get positive responses from journal editors, but we don't always school them in understanding that the failures, seeming failures they get in the lab can actually be opportunities. So I think we're training them in some parts of this now, but it's that process. It's that process of science that keeps many of us engaged that's not actually conveyed effectively. So, so I think that we do, I mean, all of us try to protect our graduate students and young faculty against being discouraged by some things, but I don't think we give them a very sophisticated framework to understand the broader roles of failure in science and how to succeed despite that. So that's the thing that I would change in the education of scientists themselves. In the education of the broader public, the process needs to be understood as one of discovery, just like anybody's discovery. We don't always start at the right place, and we don't always end up where we think we're going to. So, so I think there needs to be changes at both levels.
So you brought back in nicely there that we're not just talking about graduate students, but also, say, junior faculty who would be judged and evaluated on the worth of their research and whether it merits tenure and promotion. And it makes me think a little bit about James highlighting the insiders and the outsiders, because you can certainly bump up against some problems in graduate education of being too different and then sort of not fitting into your disciplinary. For some people, it's a groove. For other people, it's a rut. But the idea is that there's a lot of incentive structure there to not be organized in the way that, say, James suggested, for insiders and outsiders to be rubbing shoulders, or to be co-publishing in those sorts of ways. And even in the framing that James just gave us about sort of having a diversity of team structure, where you might have some large teams and you might have some small teams. I mean, at what point do you get picked for a team. Like, I want you for my crazy small disruptive team. You get to be on the large big team. And you know, who's making those decisions and when do they happen and how do they get reflected in publications? I feel like we've opened a can of worms, so we've just got to go there and start talking about these things. You're muted, James.
Sorry, I probably deserve to be muted. I wanted to just say, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult for education not to be a control system. And so, I mean, you know, how do we create an education that basically violates our discoveries and our certainties, you know? And so I think education for discovery, which in some ways is kind of the definition of graduate education, ironically, is, I think it needs to be conceived completely differently. If we want to create an education for discovery, not just for discovery, but also for robust scientific insight. And but the challenge is, of course, yes, it violates the existing power structures. I think there was a really nice paper that we recently replicated, and from a very different perspective, so I really value it in the American Economic Review, which basically showed how when really star contributors pass away, so they have a database of like 500 people who die young, you know, from car crashes, early cancer, whatever, in the scientific space. The only place you could do that is in the biosciences. That's the only place that's large enough that you could have a low error rate. And their deaths are systematically associated with a burst in productivity and advance in those subfields. And those bursts are decelerated as a function of the degree to which their students are on the review boards and the editorial councils of these journals that are effectively preserving the hegemony of particular points of view. So I think I think it's essential to think about this with respect to education, but it is very radical, and I think it transforms almost any way in which education is currently conceived in the academy that I'm aware of.
So Allison, can I ask you, in your vein of instead of and imagine, what would be some of those key re-envisionings for graduate education that would make a difference from your perspective?
I already suggested some changes, and now I have to suggest more because I started.
Well, I'm
a lot of great suggestions.
I mean, it's not.
I'm just joking.
Suggestions, but it's more in this context of, you know, those reimaginings and their challenges, but also in light of some of the other things that have been brought up by Wendy and James. I mean, it seems like the reimaginings might need to be more multidimensional in their structure, and again, raises some challenges for their implementation.
Yeah, I think what this makes me think of is, I've been sort of hammering the point of it has to be local, it has to be tailored to your discipline, it has to be tailored to the institution you're thinking of. But if we want to make things more interdisciplinary, that suggests some coordinated interventions, right? And so maybe that means I should add there should also be some solutions that are devised by maybe existing institutions that work in an interdisciplinary way, or in existing groups that work in an interdisciplinary way, like within universities, and that those groups should be attending to these kinds of challenges specifically of questions like, how do we reimagine graduate education in a way that facilitates interdisciplinary perspectives and interactions. I also think that there's a similarity here between, or a theme here between some of what James has been talking about and some of what I was talking about, of how much science gains from a multiplicity from people coming to a problem from a multiplicity of positions or perspectives, right? And so I think gearing our education so that it centered or made clear that importance for our students would be important. That sounded like a circle. Let me try again. I think as scientists, we often, at least when we're in a place where we're doing the white democratic society, Western male version of science, we like come at science and we think science is objective. There's nothing of me in science. I'm just doing this like objective knowledge creation thing that has nothing to do with who I am or my identity or my experiences or my discipline or my specific training. And I like emit knowledge from my head or something. But in fact, of course, when we stop to think about it, of course, like the questions that we ask and the approaches that we have to answering them and where we look for answers and which answers we pay attention to and which answers we ignore are all shaped by our training and our particular discipline, of course, by our experiences in life, of course, by the kinds of questions that our identities lead us to ask or overlook, right? And so we can each see like a particular slice of the road or the pie or the forest or whatever metaphor you like, that to have a strong science, we need many people looking at, let's pick forest, at the forest from many different viewpoints, and we need to be talking to them, right? So if the chemist can see this slice and the physicist can see that slice and the psychologist can see this slice, or the white woman who grew up in California, that's me, can see this slice and somebody else can see that slice, right? We need to build education structures that facilitate both our awareness that we only see one slice and our ability to coordinate and interact with people who see different slices.
Hmm. Wendy, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share further about graduate education and the pipeline of training?
I think all I would say is that there needs to be a recognition among graduate students that success is not simply publishing the most novel finding in a high-profile journal, but also doing the necessary work to identify where inconsistencies exist in scientific understanding, and highlighting those and figuring out ways to address them, even if you're not successful. Once again, I think meta-analysis is an accepted way to do that and actually to move fields forward by identifying some of those inconsistencies in the existing literature. And I know that there's some people, some scientists who maybe don't trust meta-analyses of the existing data that we have because of all the unhelpful sources of non-replicability right now in the data. But the fact that we are able, there've been a number of meta-analyses that nonetheless have identified inconsistencies and promoted the fields by showing where they occur, it suggests that it's still possible to use the existing data to build a more replicable science that actually understands where effects are and where they're not. So I'm convinced that it's still helpful to use that technique with the data we have. There have been far too many demonstrations of how effective it is to think that it's problematic. Could be better. Everything could be better.
Well, can I just add one thing? I think that's the thing, is it's like, I think there's enormous ways to push on meta-analyses, you know? So for example, just including dependencies into those things, at least for us, has dramatically increased you know, the relative weight of these things, where if you've got a bunch of groups that look independent, but they're not really independent, we can estimate, you know, so I think there, you know, insofar as there's specific problems, one can model those into a richer and richer, you know, program of estimating, you know, across field effects. So yeah, I think that it's a great frontier.
Yeah, and you're probably aware of this, James, that there are a number of meta-analyses showing that the originators of an effect and their students get much larger effect sizes than people who are working outside of that particular research group, suggesting the effects that you have been explaining in more detail.
Yeah.
But I find those in my meta-analyses. It's something that I always look for, is originator effects. And they're there.
I just nerd out on meta-analyses for one extra minute.
Yeah.
I think, you know, one issue that's extremely difficult to address well in meta-analysis, and so for me it suggests it's particularly important to try to address in other ways, is publication bias. So there are ways of modeling publication bias, but because publication bias is so complicated in terms of how it works, like there's so many messy reasons why we publish one finding and we don't publish another finding, that don't just have to do with the significance value. It has to do with the study you ran before and after, and is the student going to stay in the field, and did you lose track of it because you were doing something else, and are many other people in your lab interested, and right, and does it fit with the other study that you did? So it becomes incredibly hard to accurately model publication bias, to take it out of a meta-analysis once it has occurred.
Yeah.
And even small inaccuracies in the way that we model it can lead us to drastically wrong conclusions. So there are things you can do about that, like a sensitivity analysis that uses different models of publication bias to see how much do your estimates change. And that's better than not doing those sensitivity analyses, but you still end up with this very large range of potential values. And so it would be much more effective to, or it's also very important to address publication bias to try to get a better picture, right? A clearer picture of the knowledge we have in a field. And another form of publication bias would come from kinds of, I don't know if it's right to call this publication bias, but another thing meta-analysis can't do is it can't expand our lens beyond the slice of, you know, in psychology, the slice of humans that we're studying. So if we have only studied white Americans, and mostly those between 18 and 35 years of age, a meta-analysis on those results cannot tell us if we're actually studying human psychology or if we're studying white Americans between 18 and 35 years of age, right? And so I think that's another place where we have to intervene, like in that case on the side of data collection, to expand the samples that we're looking at.
I agree completely, but on your first point about publication bias, there are ways to estimate its effects using unpublished databases, unpublished data archives, like Dissertation Abstracts International. Dissertations have their own features, so you might argue that maybe that's not the best source of data to use. But in comparison, using those and comparing them to the published research often can be very helpful in figuring out what effects look like without several sources of publication bias. And you're absolutely right. Studies can only tell us about the things that we have looked at. And so sampling is a real issue. Subject sampling is a real issue for much of the field.
So we've got a big question that I think emerged from my initial query about possibly having multiple optima, and then James has come out stumping for multiple optima. And clearly in Wendy's conversation, there was also a discussion of different kinds of science. So this question, I think, is pushing on the way we've answered that, or at least maybe that's been heard tonight, and that is, why are we still talking about science rather than sciences or something like that?
And that's absolutely something I learned in the National Academies panel that I sat on, is that there are so many different ways of doing science that what I thought started off sort of naively thinking of as best practices turned out to be, yes, best practices in my field, but not necessarily applicable to others. So I really do understand where that questioner is coming from. It's very accurate. And I think it's interesting that we have 3 social scientists on this panel. But to your credit, Alan, we all do very different types of research. Maybe Allison and I are most similar. But we're all taking very different approaches. So at least we have that to draw on. But science has a variety of different forms.
This, I really enjoy, Rainey Daston and Peter Gallison had an edited book called The Disunity of Science. And then I would say there's a program in that, really, in the history of science, which emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I think one of the things that we found recently is that because of that diversity of the various sciences, that's actually one of the things that constitutes science as a whole. So if you look at the entropy over citations for papers from any one particular field over time, what you see is like it kind of grows up until like 1950s and 60s, and then it stays really high for the rest of the period, from the 1960s to the present. It dips a little bit, but which is to say that that even though there are differences in sciences and there are there are diversities that exist, that increasingly individual scientific papers and scientists are drawing on that diversity to make sense of their surprising discoveries and findings. So I think one of the reasons why we don't always talk about it is because it is a system of sciences that is increasingly drawn upon by each individual science, and for papers, on average, that's one of the things that characterizes modern, and by modern I mean like 1955 to the present, science, is that their site list is actually quite diverse relative to themselves, and it often will reach out beyond their field to other fields with different patterns, different epistemic commitments, different methodologies, etc. So there are definitely differences, but like increasingly those differences are a resource, for any particular science.
Allison?
I think I would just add that this question makes me think of the question I ask myself a lot these days of who's in the room when you're making policies about science or designing interventions or thinking about how best to educate our students or whatever, right? And so, for example, in psychology anyway, the people in the room at the beginning of the sort of reform movement for, let's call it different things, open science movement, replicability movement, what the people who were most of the people in that room starting that movement were from a very narrow slice of psychology, and narrow in various ways. Mostly research-focused institutions, mostly white, mostly male, mostly experimental social psychologists. And so the solutions and the approaches that the people in that room designed were often approaches that worked well for them. Let's have open criticism where we just say what we think and we don't care about people's feelings, or let's have open review where a grad student can just say what they think in a review, and the senior author writing the paper knows that the grad student didn't like their manuscript. let's pre-register all analyses ahead of time, because when you're working in my area, social cognition and psychology, you know what your analyses are going to be ahead of time because you have fairly simple experimental designs, and you probably know the decisions that you're going to have to make. And those solutions maybe worked well for people like the people in the room, right? But might not transport well to other research contexts. And those problems compound as you try to transport them further and further, right? So I think when we're designing interventions and solutions and starting to even just have ideas about how to improve science, it's really important to look at like, who's here at this table, who's not here? How do we get them here, or at least listen to their perspectives? Because when we have a greater diversity of perspectives, we're going to design stronger solutions that transport more broadly.
So, I mean, it sounds a little bit to me like we need a richer vocabulary to communicate about this, you know, whether it's talking about audience and context, or as James was highlighting, are we talking about the system from the perspective of citation, or are we talking about the, you know, the system in the sense of a social organization? Because these matter, they're different. But obviously, when somebody is first introduced to science, capital S, they're usually taught the 6-step scientific method and a little cartoon, and so I think it maybe suggests from our earlier conversation that the question about the pipeline might start much earlier in the way we think about how the sciences are communicated. And I mean, maybe, James, this is the potentially most disruptive thing. It's not what might be done with the graduate students, but what might be done in kindergarten, for sort of reorienting people to a complex process of inquiry, so that it comes to be the standard expectation for what's going on, rather than a surprising finding that you bump into when your experiments don't go the way you want them to as a second-year graduate student.
Yeah, only a subset of scientists actually do hypothesis testing experiments. And the way science is conducted right now, there's a huge amount going on with proprietary data that actually some of the findings get fed back into the broader literature, but they're not subject. The process is not subject to the same way that we think of the standard scientific process. So there's so many different ways of doing science, and yeah, understanding that diversity is really important.
Other thoughts on this, James?
I was just going to say, I think there's one trade-off that is critical, because I really do appreciate Wendy's comments about failure, for example. Like, I think we need to increase certain kinds of failures. There's no question in the scientific system, but from the perspective, for example, of individual, graduate students, or going down to the kindergarten level, you've got a situation where, if you fail in pulling together like a series of skills, and here I don't even mean fail as in like you don't find the right thing, but if you pull together a set of skills that aren't valued as a bundle, then you become devalued. Right, and so there is a risk. There's like a genuine risk that if like you're going to go off, trying to combine different kinds of things, and it's not just if it doesn't work in the context of like a paper, but if the entire field doesn't follow that, then your skill set will be discounted by the market, just sort of this like this. And so I think there is a fundamental challenging trade-off between basically like the valuation of a set of skills, because of course, even if this 10 there's 10 labs that are racing to a discovery. One of them is credited, with getting there first. They achieved the discovery a day before the others. All those people who are working in all those labs have this valuable skill set. If that skill wins, if it gets translated to industry, et cetera, that's available. You've produced through that competition, not just, again, a kind of like slightly ridiculous award, but actually a broad base of skills, that are focused on that kind of an approach. And so I think there is a real challenge and balance that we need to think about the value of human capital that gets cultivated in this context and the value of discoveries to the system, because there are two sets of incentives that drive those two systems that are in conflict most of the time.
Yeah. Well, we are almost out of time, and I think that for a symposium on the frontiers of reproducibility, it would be an appropriate way to close our time by hearing a few predictions from our guests about where they think the frontiers will be, maybe on a 3, 5, 10-year horizon. This is your license to speculate. You don't necessarily have to have a complete data set behind you. I think the audience would just be curious to hear your parting thoughts about where you think things will be in 5 to 10 years. So, Wendy, could we start with you?
Sure. I mean, following from my talk, I give my aspirational future, which is that we learn to value failures, not just successes. So just as we know, we already value now what people who ask the more interesting questions. So maybe we could also have a group of people who really help us think through why some things don't work in science. And we could value them for their ability to identify these failures and perhaps move us forward in that way. So yeah, that would be what I would like to see.
Interesting. James.
I'm sorry. I'm really hopeful about science. I love science. I want science to get better. But I think that the pressures for pouring resources into these large central groups that are reducing the diversity in science are I mean, there are enormous interest groups that are behind that. There are, so I think we're going to see more centralization before we see less, and which I think increases the importance of this research to continue to highlight the costs of that. I think it's going to, we're going to need to, and I think the only way that's going to be beaten is by taking that into account to do better science. Not through some essential finding, but by the groups that actually exploit that diversity by, discovering things that were invisible to others in the scientific space. So I think the burden really is on us, not just, philosophizing about science, but actually working with the scientific system to produce things that will demonstrate these values. And, because they're battling against some really strong institutional forces and other, seemingly benign forces, like information is everywhere, and the provision of free data sets and ubiquitous communication. I think these are, these bring all kinds of wonderful benefits, but they also reduce and focus the attention space of science in ways that I think is likely to decrease reproducibility in some ways in future years. And I think we need to resist those productively and analytically.
Allison.
Well, like everyone, probably I have a dystopian view and a utopian view of the future. And I really see the moment we're in right now as the fork in the road. I think so much depends on what we do or don't do, like, or at least start doing right now. So the dystopian view is if we just sort of continue on the course that the pandemic puts us on. And I think inaction, or the kind of very limited action that many universities have taken of having like an option for a 1-year extension on tenure clocks, which we know from research that has looked into exactly that kind of policy, ends up just raising the bar for everybody and increasing gender disparities. So that kind of way of addressing it is insufficient. There's a record number of women exiting the workforce in general. If you look at who is submitting manuscripts right now, there are glaring gender and racial disparities. So if we don't do anything, I think we're headed for a science that maybe goes back, or sciences that maybe go back to our roots of being a very like white and male dominated place. I think if we do act, and I think there's some momentum and interest around acting, because a lot of people would like to not head down that road, then we have a possibility of setting ourselves on a course for a much more open and inclusive science and stronger science, and probably interdisciplinary science than we've seen before. And so I hope we go in that direction. And I think there are so many things that we can do both individually and collectively in our various roles that could set us on that course. So I am hopeful that we take the opportunity to do that.
Well, I hear reasons for hope, reasons for caution, reasons to make sure that we are making the appropriate investments that need to be made on lots of different frontiers of reproducibility. So with that, I'd like to bring our time to a close and say thank you to all three of you for taking the time to join us today, share your perspective, give us some real insight on these questions. And I thank the audience for their perspective and the way they stimulated this conversation. And I look forward to future opportunities. And if there are more thoughts along this line that people want to send to us, please do let us know. You can find us at reproducibility.umn.edu. With that, thank you all and good night.
Thank you all. Thank you, other panelists, Allison, Wendy, and Alan.
Thank you, Alan.